Welcome to the Encore Audio Archives YouTube channel. I'm Taper Dave, and this is my channel. I've uploaded hundreds of talks here that I've recorded at meetings in West LA, and I've also recorded conventions starting in 2013. I've got a bunch of those up. And Walt and Mary Murray, the original owners of Encore Audio Archives, started the company in the 80s, and Walt recorded Joe and Charlie's and a bunch of stuff down in Vista, California. My sobriety date is June 20th of 1994. I hope you find something you like, so please like and subscribe to my channel and comment down below. If you want to hear something that I don't have or that you don't see, I'll see that I get it. Anyways, take care and have a great day if you want to.
And I've been around for a while, but I am just bowled over again and again by stories that just can't possibly happen. They have to be called miraculous. And I've come to believe that a miracle is not something that defies the laws of science or any kind of laws, doesn't break any laws, but it just is one of those things that defies expectation, probability. It's just way out there on some kind of a bell-shaped curve, so that people would say, that just can't happen, it just wouldn't happen. And it happens all the time in these spiritual meetings. This amazing program has kept me sober now for over 34 years. And certainly take no credit for that, but that is really all I have to say. But I'm going to rave on anyway. But everything I say is just an elaboration of those two things. I'm an alcoholic, and yet this program's kept me sober for a long time. And we know that that just can't be done by human power alone. I came first to the program in 1969, but as I said, my sobriety date is February 8, 1972. So, why was that so? Well, when I came in 1969, I knew that I'm not an alcoholic. You'd say, why did you go to Alcoholics Anonymous? And I would say, because other people thought I was an alcoholic. And I had no idea why they used such harsh words to me. And it could have been because I'd lost my job several years before because of my drinking, and now I was doing nothing but drinking. But it didn't seem that that was what was wrong with me, because the world had treated me unkindly. And I'd had a lot of bad breaks and misunderstandings. And alcohol was my one friend that allowed me to get through day after day after day of this miserable existence. And here there was a program that was suggesting that I give that up. But in order to please people, because that has been an interesting and strange character defect. The unwholesome desire to grovel before you and say, like me, I'll do anything. I went to Alcoholics Anonymous. But without believing that I was an alcoholic, it didn't quite take. I had some bad experiences. I would go to dark, quiet meetings, and before long somebody would take my hand and say, you're pretty intense. I know a group that's just right for you. And they'd lead me into this great big active group in West LA, the Pacific Group. And they had lots of lights on and intrusive people asking all kinds of questions. Questions like, do you have a sponsor? Do you have a home group? Do you have a sobriety date? Do you have a job at this meeting? Now, the answer was no to all those questions, but please don't ask. There was a person that I saw, a person named Marylyn, that seemed to radiate some kind of peace of mind, joy, sense of purpose. She always had people flocking around her. And I never approached her, certainly never thought of asking her to be my sponsor. I think that I was kind of waiting for her to come over and say, you look wonderful. And I'd like to take you under my wing and love you to pieces and just be there for you forever and ever. Say yes, say yes. And she didn't do that. And so I never talked to her. So I left the fellowship and decided to take a few of those ideas and cut back on my drinking, of course, to take the heat off. And I did things like make little rules. I'm only going to drink 2 cans of beer a day. And that worked. That worked really well. It enabled me in no time to up it to a 6-pack. And then I'd come out of a blackout in a garage and just wonder how I'd lost count. And I did that for several years. And one day I got up and I wanted a little social life. I was more or less living in a garage. And my social life was to sneak into the house. And make a phone call, and the contact that I had left, the people that still talk to me, that was my social life. That was calling Central Office of Alcoholics Anonymous. I had that number, and I liked to argue with them. I'd say, now, I don't have a problem, but if I did, I wouldn't call you. And they'd want to get off the phone, of course, and I'd say, don't go. I want to tell you why I wouldn't call you. And I'd often say, it's because this program has a spiritual basis, and we all know that that's nonsense, and nothing with a spiritual basis could work. It has to be scientific. And the person on the phone would say, well, it probably wouldn't work for you, but we do have people that are helped, and those are the people we want to talk to, so we have to go now. Well, one day in 1972, February 8th to be exact, I called up to have a little social life, and this was a different kind of person on the phone. She began to ask me questions instead of just getting off in a hurry. And I kind of liked that because I thought, I'm having a wonderful visit with somebody. This is fulfilling this need for social contact. And yet I was beginning to get nervous because these questions were like, what is your name? And then even more hideous, she would say, Marylyn, now tell me, are you sure you don't drink? And I'd say, well, not much, and I only drink beer now. And she'd say, well, how much do you drink? And when was your last drink? And I was getting nervous, and this time I was thinking, I've got to go now. But before I got off the phone, she managed to learn my address. And she sent somebody to get me. So if you're new and you want to keep on drinking, don't give them your address. So, not too long after that, it was a knock at the door, and I had come into the house, and Lorena showed up on my doorstep. Now, let me tell you, Lorena is sober to this day in Ojai, so it's good to do 12-step work. It keeps you sober for a long time. She'd been sober for a few years when she paid a call on me, and she said, I'm going to take you to a meeting. And I said, well, that's a long time away. Why don't you go home now? And then we'll come back and then we'll go. And she said, no, I'll stay right here. And I said, but I'm tired. I need a nap. She said, stretch out on the couch. I'll just sit here and read a magazine. So she wasn't going anywhere. And she meant business. So we waited and waited. And so I thought, this is going to happen. So I better make the ground rules. And I explained to her what I needed, and that was a dark, quiet meeting. I like this because I can't see you. And that's good. So I told her that's what I needed, all the lights down low. Nobody asking questions. She knew about such a meeting. She said she'd take me to. And I said, but one thing for sure, don't take me to the Pacific group. And she said, I know that group, and I won't take you to the Pacific group. So I began to feel reassured, and then I said, and one more thing, and she was still rolling her eyes. And I said, do you know somebody named Marion? And she didn't know Marion, but she said that if you come with me, and if you stay sober, and if Marion is still sober, you'll meet up again and again, because that's how Alcoholics Anonymous is. There's Ted and Fran, our old-timer Ted, and Fran, and my friend Jonathan, and I just come to meet. I didn't expect to see them, but here we show up, and we run into each other every few years, and it's wonderful. So Lorena was explaining that to me, and then she said, come with me, come with me. And by that time I had, since I'm a sick and hideous parasite, I said, okay, I know that wants to please you. I'll do it. And I knew she was going to obey the ground rules, so I had sort of attached, and off we went. And it was a dark and quiet meeting, as Lorena had promised. And I sat down, and I was able to go to sleep, and that was good. And then the coffee break was jarring, and I woke up, and finally they were settling down, and I was hoping to be able to doze off again. And the leader got up and said, and tonight our main speaker is Marion. And I looked up, and there was my Marion. And in my alcoholic fog, I thought, wow, this is a strange coincidence. And she talked, and strangely, I was able to hear what she said. She talked about fear. She talked about dependency, being dependent on a man she was no longer married to in her drinking. And she talked about him walking around the kitchen, and she'd be dragged around the kitchen floor holding onto his ankles. And I thought to myself, that's the kind of person I am. I just wait for somebody to come along and attach. And after the meeting, I ran up to the podium, dropped to the floor, and grabbed her ankles, of course. Marion. And this time I didn't wait for her. I just said, Marion, will you be my sponsor? Will you be my sponsor? And she smiled kindly on me and said, yes, it's a privilege to sponsor people. And I will show you the meetings I go to, and these are the meetings you must come to. And yes, you guessed, she circled all the meetings of the Pacific group. Now, I had already attached to Marion, and I didn't want her to get away. And that saved my life, because I said, okay, Marion, even that. And took the meeting directory home and gritted my teeth and went to the meeting late, of course, so I could just sit down and not have to talk to anybody. And then Marion explained it's important to come a half an hour early. And I explained I can't do that because people think I'm strange and they don't like me. I don't have any friends, and I never will. And she said, well, here's a little group. Why don't you go over and talk to them? All right. So I stepped up to a little threesome, and I said, hi, I'm a scientist. Now, I could have predicted it. They just kind of turned and eased away, formed other little threesomes, And I was glad because I could run back to Marion and say, see, they don't like me and they never will and they won't talk to me. And Marion said, okay, I kind of overheard that. Now, why don't you step over to this threesome and this time tell them your name first and then tell them how long you've been sober and just see what happens. All right, well, I know it's not going to work. But mutter. And so I stepped up to another threesome and said, hi, I'm Marylyn. I've been sober for 5 days. And much to my surprise, they turned toward me. And they said, that's wonderful. Do you have a sponsor? And this time I had an answer. I said, yes, it's Marion. And then they smiled. And it made me so proud because they approved of Marion. And then whatever I did, they just kept saying, keep coming back. Keep coming back. It does get better. I could even tell them I was a scientist, and they'd just say, keep coming back. But I found that early sobriety was not pretty. We did things like get in cars with other people, ride to meetings, to panels, to institutions, rode out to Tehachapi with people, and in those days everybody smoked. I didn't smoke, but everybody else did, so I smoked. And the car would be driving along, and if anybody looked in the window, they wouldn't see people, just this gray cloud. And I just had no idea what to say to people and felt so uncomfortable. But I had my friend, my Marion that I adored, the great goddess of sobriety, and she had become my higher power. One day I walked into our home group, the big Pacific group, and it was 250 in those days, and now still my home group. It's now about 900 people, but in those days it was containable in a small meeting house, and we were all packed in like sardines and a lot of energy. And I walked in the door, and Marion's husband was standing as secretary that night, and he said, Marylyn, I want you to be a 10-minute speaker tonight. And I just said, oh, no. I'm new and I don't have anything to say. And what I really knew was that I'm not really an alcoholic. But I didn't say that because I was passing and I wanted Marion's approval. So Byron just smiled and nodded, and he said, go talk with your sponsor about that. Just go mention that to Marion. I was glad to do that because I knew that Marion loved me more than anything else in the world and would protect me and stand by me and support everything I wanted to do. And I explained the situation, and much to my surprise, she looked disappointed. And that was breaking my heart. And she said, oh, Marylyn, that's an AA request. We always say yes to AA because recovery depends on our saying yes to AA. So important to do that. So go talk to Byron and say, I've reconsidered. I would love to be a 10-minute speaker, and thank you for asking me to participate in my own sobriety. I didn't hear much, but that line, what an order, I can't go through with it, through my brain. And so I went over and explained what I was supposed to Byron, and he just smiled and nodded and said, I'm glad you reconsidered. And they called my name, and I got up and just thought, I don't know what to do. But this program says we have to be rigorously honest, and I'm going to try to do that. So I thought, I'm going to talk about those things that are important to me, the things that have made my life the way it is, the things that have impinged on my soul that have brought me to this point in 1972. And I summoned up all the courage, and I was honest at the podium. I talked about living in Ohio, being born there and growing up in a state that just clearly did not understand me. Talked about a family that tried their best, but they just never could please me. And talked about things not going my way, and a lot of sappy people in Ohio that did things like take pies to new neighbors and how silly they were. And then I talked about my growth into atheism. I talked about testing, and Bob kind of talked about that idea of God, where we say, God, are you there? And if you are, here's my list of requirements. This is what I want you to do. Get to work for me, in other words. I'd make tests like that. And God just kind of ignored me, didn't pass those tests, which allowed me scientifically to conclude there is no God. And I explained that. And then I talked about life being very painful. And then I talked about existential angst that had plagued me much of my life. It was so severe sometimes that it was paralyzing depression, and sometimes even suicidal depression. And then I would return to atheism and how that was shaped by studying science for many years, which convinced me that the elegant laws of physics, chemistry, and biology can explain it all, and anybody who doesn't believe that surely is lacking in understanding. And then I would return to existential angst. And then I got the signal that it's time to quit, and thought I'd better end on a profound note. And so I said that what these years have taught me is that the universe is one big, hideous wind-up toy. Thank you very much. And I sat down. And there was because this is Alcoholics Anonymous, and we care. But I couldn't wait to run to Marion at the break and say, how did I do? How did I do? And I was just living for those pats on the head. And she said, it was good that you said yes to AA. That was good. But Marylyn, she said to me, you're going to have to start mentioning that you drank. And I thought, why? Because that had so little to do with the pain that I felt, the things that had shaped my life. But wanting to please Marion more than anybody else on earth, I started talking about my drinking to everybody. They didn't want to hear it particularly, but I started doing it because I wanted Marion's approval. And if I was called to participate, I started talking about my drinking. Much to my great surprise, I found out that not only had alcohol been a big part of my life, it had directed the course of my life. Moreover, as I talked about my drinking, I began to realize that I sound like other alcoholics an awfully lot. I realized as I began to talk about my drinking, I remembered my first drink. Now, I'm married to a non-alcoholic. And if I said to him, when did you have your first drink? He says something like, of what? And I say, of alcohol. Alcohol. When did you have your first drink of alcohol? And he would look at me like I'd ask, when did you first hear about Boise? Like, I don't know. But it made a big impression on me. I was back in Ohio. I was 8 years old, and I had a toothache. And that was in the old days in Ohio. So the remedy was my mom filled up a little cotton ball with scotch and told me to hold it on my tooth. And I sucked that cotton ball dry and asked for a refill. And that was good. She left the bottle of scotch in my room, and I enjoyed my toothache all night long. And this was Ohio. It was kind of a naive time. Just didn't occur to me to look for those bottles. I just suffered in pain. And yet when I was 12 years old, I went to an office party with my mom. She worked for the Air Force in Ohio, and we were there at the Officers Club. And as I walked into the room, there was an aroma in the air that said, cotton ball. Now, what it was that there were a lot of non-alcoholics, clearly, because they had mixed drinks, and they just walked away and lost their glasses, half filled. And I polished them off, and I had my first blackout, and that was wonderful. I came out of my blackout outside in some bushes with my mom's boss, a colonel. And he was groping and pawing, and I was looking up at him saying, this is the happiest moment of my life. All 12 years of it, and that was good. And then I was back in my blackout. I don't remember too much until I came out of it, back in the Officers Club. This time I was pawing and groping the colonel. And he was trying to explain to his wife that he had never seen this strange child before and didn't know what she was doing. And then I was riding home in the back seat of a car, singing at the top of my lungs, Mom weeping silently in the front seat, talking about those terrible people that got her sweet little daughter drunk. That was a good evening. But as I said, this was a strange time, and I'm a slow learner at most things, and I did not realize that alcohol was the solution to all the things that caused me pain. Not for a long time. So I suffered. That's the explanation for the existential angst that plagued so much of my life. I learned that it had a different name in Alcoholics Anonymous many years later. I found out that it's called things like character defects and selfish and self-centered living. That was the thing that caused me pain. Not other people, not Ohio, not existential angst. That was the byproduct of the way that I lived, which was a hard concept for me to grasp. I never could have grasped it in those days. I didn't grasp it for a long time until Alcoholics Anonymous and the steps of this program. So I was living there, trying so hard to get you to like me and respect me. I was trying so hard to make myself happy. And I've become convinced that a life lived for self-gratification, to make ourselves happy, is one guaranteed to make us so miserable we'll want to kill ourselves. If that's all we want to do is make ourselves happy. I also believe that if we live our lives I live my life to get you to like me or respect me, I will always go through this world thinking you don't like me and you don't respect me, if that's my goal. And that's how I was living. So it was not fun. But there were those moments, and I went away. I escaped from Ohio and went off to study science, and that seemed to be, it was a higher power for me for many years. I fulfilled that role. It was something bigger than myself, and it was something I could think about and more or less pray to. I studied it. I worshipped it. And as a higher power, I could see that it provided people with what they needed. You could get a job as a scientist, and it would take care of your needs. It also would allow me to fit in with other scientists and speak an esoteric language that would allow me finally maybe to join the human race. Well, maybe not the human race, but a tiny part of it. And I began to learn the language of science. a big break occurred when I went to get a job. I was at the University of Chicago, and I entered the Fermi Institute to apply for a job. And a scientist in a white lab coat came in the lab to give me the test, and it involved using a microscope. And he had long, slender fingers. And as he turned the knobs of the microscope, I was getting excited. And he had this white lab coat, and he had a slide rule in his pocket. Now, some of you are young, but a slide rule is actually an old-fashioned calculator. And I just saw that, and I wanted to grab and fondle his slide rule. I got the job. And after a few weeks, I did. He went off to a meeting after I began working in the lab, and he sent a postcard back, and it had a picture of the Lincoln Memorial, and I turned it over, and it said, "Marylyn, I was thinking about what you were saying, but all I could come up with is," and he wrote out this elegant partial differential equation. No man had ever talked to me like that before. And then one day he said, "Do you want to get married?" And I said, "Yes, yes." So we went off to Ohio, and his dad was a Lutheran minister of all things. And so here we were in this quaint ceremony, and his dad was saying things like better, worse, sickness, health, richer, poor, honor, cherish. And Bill was listening, and he's a man of his word. He believes in keeping commitments. He said, "I do." And he had absolutely no idea what he was agreeing to. And then his dad turned to me and he said those same words, and it was clear I was supposed to say something, so I said, "I do." But what I meant was, now I can attach to you like a tick on a dog and suck out your life. And I proceeded to do just that. And after a while, we moved to California, and I thought things were going to get better because, I mean, you can just talk about the theory of relativity and gravitational force so long, and it gets a little thin. And then pretty soon I resorted to my main ploy, which was, "You're the reason I'm so miserable. You never take me skiing." And Bill would always say something like, "Well, we can go skiing." And I'd say, no, because you didn't think of it first. And as I said, I mean, with this kind of living, which of course we learn is selfish and self-centered living, and with lots of character defects, which is bound to bring us down and make us drink ourselves to death, I was just doing that on the natch, feeling a lot of existential angst all the time. And but by this time I had my own lab, my own white jacket, and my own slide rule, and my work was not going well, but I got a lucky break. We entered the 60s. Now, again, if you're young and you didn't live through that time and you're an alcoholic, you really missed something. That was a time when anything goes or went, and it was fun. The lab was fun. We had lab alcohol, and the feds were not so cautious as they are today. Money flowed freely, so I just sort of squandered the lab funds that were given to me in a fellowship, and thought that I'm a deserving person. They just think I'm really clever, and they should just pay me, and I should be able to do anything, which seemed to be breaking a lot of glassware and causing some minor explosions. And because it was the 60s, that stuff was tolerated. And the university was shaking at its foundation. There were sit-ins and laugh-ins and love-ins, and it occupied the chancellor's office and threatened, well, actually, they did shut down the university now and then. And I loved it. I just loved it. The chaos. The lab alcohol. Then we'd go out at night and drink at bars like the Oar House with great big oars over the door, and they'd bring around pitchers of beer for 50 cents. But what I liked most were the protests. There's a lot of dissent during that time, and people were mad, and I didn't know why they were mad, but I knew why I was mad. I was mad at Ohio. I was mad at people that didn't like me, that people didn't respect me. And in those days, you had free rein to be mad. I could carry a sign and go out and march and scream and yell and growl and beat people with my sign. And felt so good finally to get some of that anger out in a very loud way with other angry people. And that wasn't even the best part. We'd retire to somebody's apartment, and they called it a pad, and that was good because there'd be dim lights and weird music. It's always flickering light because we drank enormous quantities of wine from these big jugs, and when one was empty, somebody would stuff a candle in it. It would melt down the sides and just look so pretty. And there was always something soft to sit on. That was usually the people that had gotten there earlier. And fun. And it was so much fun that I just moved a lot of beer, my favorite drink, into the lab, and I moved it into a great big refrigerated room and changed the nature of my research from muscle protein to muscle protein at low temperatures, and just went into that cold room and sat there with a parka on every day for about 3 years until the director said, "Oh, yes, Marylyn, what have you been doing here? And you've been here a while. Why don't you write up what you've been doing?" And I thought, what have I been doing? I have no idea. And although while I was drinking there in the cold room, I felt like the Nobel Prize is really close now. I'm doing the best work of my life, is how I felt. I was doing really nothing, but that was why alcohol was so wonderful. It gave me the sense of being a great scientist without doing any science. Well, that encounter with the director seemed to be the end of my career. I didn't really have the courage to say, I don't have anything to write up. I'm sorry about that. I just went home and sat on the couch and mailed the keys back 3 months later. These were strange years. Now I had nothing to do but drink. I spent a lot of time in the garage because the house scared me. It was so light, and people walked by, and I could not get the windows shut tightly enough to think that they're not going to come in. And so I retired to the garage where it was darker and quieter. While I was out there in the garage, our house filled up with small children, and they seemed to be mine. And I didn't know how that was happening. I had seemed to lose all control. I'd sit there in the garage and I would think, I'm going to go in and I'm going to be a good mom, because I was feeling bad. I knew that was my place, and I'm spending a lot of time in the garage, and they need me in there, so I'm going to go in and I'm going to start today. First, I'm going to count them and just see what I'm dealing with. And after a few cans of beer, I'd be steady enough to go in, but then they'd move. They moved around. And then I noticed a very large one, and that was my mother-in-law. She had been there for a long, long time. And that was bad news because I began to get the picture. I was like that mangy animal that drifts into the backyard. And if it's a kind family, they kind of regard it as a pet, like a possum or something. And they'd set out food. But, if such a thing comes near the door, they get out the broom and kind of say, shoo, stay in the backyard. I realized that they liked that I stayed in the garage. Because I was a danger. I was a danger to the household, to these little children that I had not been able to take care of. And yet I kept giving birth to them. And my mother-in-law would say things like, unless you get control of your life and stop drinking so much, we're going to have to see that you get locked up, and you'll probably never see the children again. And I just thought, how dare she talk to me like that? I mean, this is my garage. But she meant it. And that's why I began to make those trips into Alcoholics Anonymous. But of course, it didn't work the first time until the wonderful Marylyn came into my life. And because Marylyn told me to talk about my drinking, I saw the pattern. My gosh. Not only did I see the pattern, I began to tell my story, and other people would come up and say, man, you went pretty far down the line. And things like that used to terrify me when people in the lab would say, you seem like an alcoholic. Now I was so happy because I thought, I really do belong here. I mean, I can tell my story, and they think I'm a bad alcoholic. How wonderful. Of course, this program gave me my story because it forced me to put my life in the context of what I hear. And why was that good? Well, it was good because I believe unless we admit to our innermost selves that we're alcoholics, it just doesn't work for us. We have to do that. But there was another good, and that was that because now I knew I was an alcoholic, probably what had worked for you, what had worked for Marylyn, might work for me too. It might apply. And I had a little bit more faith. But this whole God thing was very baffling. I'd hold on to things. The first mystical thing that I could hold on to was the fact that Marylyn was the speaker at that meeting I was brought back to. But I just had this many, many years of scorning God, and I couldn't say the word God. Our Father, that seems so religious to me. So when we'd stand up and pray together, I would say, okay, I'm going to stand up and cooperate because I need approval. But I'm going to say to myself, great force in the universe that somehow brought it about that Marylyn was the speaker at the meeting that I was brought back to. And then I could say amen with everybody else. And then one day I was talking with an old-timer, John, had 40 years of sobriety at that time, and he was kind to me. And I was explaining that I just couldn't believe in God and didn't know how to take the steps without believing in God. And he just laughed and said, oh, Marylyn, your thoughts are your prayers and your religion is your life. And that meant a lot to me. And I began to think about what I prayed to all the time. And that was, they don't like you, do they? You're not fitting in. You're not really a good AA. And Marylyn probably doesn't love you more than all of her other babies. And I was praying to myself much of the time. My religion was my life. But I was living the life of Alcoholics Anonymous. I was going to a meeting every night, getting fully involved because I needed approval. It's funny how these character defects, like this desperate need for approval, work to my good. I believe this God that I came to know in Alcoholics Anonymous takes this horrid heap that we bring into this fellowship. We don't bring a lot usually just a big bag of character defects, but uses everything for our good, for our recovery. And that defect certainly was, because I took the actions that contributed to my sobriety, that were my sobriety. I believe that motives don't count a lot, but our actions count for everything. And so I was doing that. And one day I just thought to myself, you know what I could do about this God business? I could just know what I mean. But I could really say that word, but I would know it means that mystical force that somehow brought it about, defying all probability that Marion was that speaker at that first meeting that I was brought. I would know what it meant. But I'll just say God anyway. And it worked. I fit in even better. And I was explaining that to my friend John, and explained this long story. And he looked at me and he said, so you're saying to me, your higher power is this force, and that yet you say the word God, but you know just what you mean by that. It's not what other people mean. Are you saying that? And I said, yeah, that's it, John. That was my idea, my wonderful idea. And then he laughed again and said, well, Marylyn, I hate to break this to you, but that's what we're all doing. God as we understand God. And this program really has been this courtship with God, of course, as we all experience through the steps. Just getting to know a little bit more, and mostly experiencing it through these strange coincidences, through these unlikely events, as unlikely as every AA story where we hear about somebody coming in, living in a car, living on Skid Row, coming out of a garage, and yet having a happy, productive life. A lot of force. And things were happening on the home front, too. I was able to count my children after a while. And there were only 3 of them. And it was a big surprise to me. And I don't remember too much, but one of my first memories was a Christmas time. Now, as I told you, my sobriety date is February, and some of my first conscious moments were at Christmas time, so I was approaching 1 year by that time. But I do remember there was a Christmas tree, and my mother was there helping out. I had a lot of help from the grandmas, my mother-in-law and my mother in those crazy drinking years and in early sobriety. Okay. And at this Christmas time, there were a lot of presents under the tree, lots, because there was a grandma in the house. They could arrange that. And these 3 little children, they were still small when I got sober. And our little son David was between 2 and 3, and he was able to talk and able to open his own presents. And he opened one after the other, and he opened them pretty fast. And he opened 26 presents. And at the end of that, he looked around, and there were no more. And he started crying, just burst into tears. And my mother said, David, what's wrong? Why are you so sad? And he said, I didn't get just what I always wanted. And she said, well, David, what is that? And he said, I don't know. I just know I didn't get it. And I thought, oh, my son has summed it up so well. Oh, that's how it felt. It went through life. And there would be something shiny and big like marrying a scientist. No, that's not quite it. Like getting my own lab. No. Just one present after another, which truly were gifts, but they weren't quite right. They didn't take me skiing. But I was beginning to hear things, and I worried a lot. I worried about feeling so guilty about my children, and old-timers would say, well, have you written an inventory? And I'd say, no, because I'm so anxious. I just can't sit down and concentrate. You have to help me solve these problems first. And they'd say, well, do you work with newcomers? And I'd say, no, I don't really have anything to say to a newcomer. But wanting approval so desperately, I began to do these things. My sponsor moved away before I was 1 year sober, and I had to give up the wonderful Marion. And I thought, I can't stay sober without Marion. And Marion said, you'll find another Marion. Well, she was wrong. I never found another Marion. But it was time for me to break some of those dependencies, to transfer some of that dependency to my home group, to a whole constellation of old-timers, to the fellowship as a whole, eventually to this thing I call God, this force. And that was a part of the process, everything being used for good as long as I say yes to AA. Over the years, I realized that I'm beginning to use the past tense in a lot of things. Newcomers would say, I just don't believe in God, and I don't know how I can take these steps. And I told my story, and I said, and one day the veil parted, and I said, my gosh, you've been there all along, haven't you? And it was so obvious, the moment it was obvious, but not a moment before. I told some old-timers how spectacular. I came into contact with this thing that, of course, is God. And they said, sure. Having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, it's guaranteed. But for me, it was a big deal coming from where I was, believing that chemistry, physics explains it all. And I must say that I have a much greater appreciation for chemistry and physics because I see the mystery, the power behind that now. And that is certainly one of these gifts. Because I took the steps, I was able to grow up with my children. Because I worked with newcomers, I was able to listen to them when they talked about their sadnesses. Was even able to go back to work because Alcoholics Anonymous taught me how to work. You usually, if you work, you have a job, and that job has tasks involved. And if you have a job, you usually have a boss. That's like a crew chief in Alcoholics Anonymous. And that person will explain to you when you're doing your job and when you aren't. And if you do that job, you get a paycheck, and you get to keep your job, and you don't make waves with fellow workers. I never knew things like that, but AA taught me that. I made amends to the director of that lab where I drank all the beer, and he just acted kind of embarrassed. But old-timers said, the apology is the first part. You have to amend your conduct. And I said, how can I amend my conduct? I'm not there anymore. Well, take a job in AA, work for Southern California Convention. Just get active, get busy, do a good job wherever you are. That makes amends to the universe. When it's time to go back to work, there'll be a knock at the door. And one day, the director of the lab called and asked me if I wanted to go back to the lab and work. And I said, they said there'd be a knock at the door. I did go back and work there, and much to my surprise, although I felt deep and horrible embarrassment, they just remembered me as a sick person in the old days. And they'd say things like, Marylyn, do you remember in the old days that Christmas party when Tom threw you into the centrifuge? And I think, yeah, I remember those days. But I've discovered that normal people, healthy, wholesome, well-adjusted people, do not have negative memories of people. They give people the benefit of the doubt, and if somebody is acting strange and vindictive and terrible, they just write them off as sick and crazy people, just like our big book advises us to do with resentments. And that's very hard, because so many resentments are justifiable. They deserve to be hated. But normal people don't seem to get hung up on that. So I was welcomed back, and I've worked ever since, and I got into information science, which I enjoy very much, and I don't blow up things and break glassware anymore, and computers are, I'm safe around those, and I've enjoyed working because AA taught me how to work. AA brought back so many things, and gave me many things I didn't even have. I had learned rock climbing when I was a graduate student, and then started drinking a lot of beer and lost all my climbing partners. No, not in the way you might think, but they just didn't want to climb with me. And as I was sober, our little son, he was about 12 years old, said he'd like to learn rock climbing because he had seen a TV show. And I was worried about David because David had caused me. He seemed to suffer more than our two daughters from my drinking. And he was a fearful little kid, afraid of everything. When he drew pictures, he drew them all with dark colors. And I'd say, "That's nice, David. What did you draw?" And he'd say, "Scary thing." And then he began to steal from my purse. Then he began to steal from other people's purses and the local stores. And I just didn't know what to do. And I talked to friends in Alcoholics Anonymous. And they said, "Listen to him. Just sit down." And we began to spend time together, but it still didn't help. And I was at my wit's end. And they'd say, "Well, turn it over to God." And I'd turn it over to God. "Okay, God. I don't want to tell you what to do, but I think it must be your will that our son doesn't grow up to be Al Capone. I mean, it must be your will that he stops stealing, isn't it? I don't want to ask you for too much, but I tried to turn it over, and he kept stealing." So here was this fearful little kid wanting to learn rock climbing. Well, that was a good sign, I thought. And so I said, "But you got to learn to do it right. We'll do that through the Sierra Club." And we joined the Sierra Club together. And I had to go with him because he was a minor. And we got into basic mountaineering and some rock climbing. And much to my surprise, David really took to that. He is mechanically inclined, like his dad, who's a scientist, so he could handle the ropes and all of that equipment, the protection that you put into rocks so that that anchors you in. And we climbed together, and I was realizing that Alcoholics Anonymous is like the Sierra Club in that human beings are in it and work together for a common cause. And because I was fitting into AA, I fit in there too. We began to climb, and soon David and I, before he got way beyond me and could out-climb me, he was now 14 or 15, maybe even 16, and we were out climbing together. We'd gone to a place down in Southern California, Takis Rock, with a wonderful bunch of routes, and I was belaying David. He usually took the lead because he was a strapping, strong little guy and very good, and I trusted him completely with putting in anchors. And so he climbed up, and I was holding onto the rope, and I just looked at our young son growing into a man, how strong and confident he was, and thinking, if this is all there is, my gosh, thank you, God. Thank you for this moment. And I realized that I'm holding David's life in my hands with this rope. If I let it go, he could go down about 400 feet straight down. And they didn't even like me to come in the garage and talk to the children in the old days. And now we're sitting out on this vertical rock, me holding David right here with this rope. And then he anchored in, and so I could release my anchors and start climbing up the rope up to where David was anchored in. And as I was climbing, I just thought, it's been a long time since David stole anything. And I just thought, yeah, that's the way my higher power works. I have to get desperate enough until I turn something over. And then I realized that that doesn't work. There's not an instant answer. There probably never will be an answer. And there often isn't until I forget about it completely and then realize that in some kind of elegant way, my problem is solved in a way I would never, ever guess. And then I see, in retrospect, the elegance of it all. We also watched our daughters walk down the aisle with mates of their very own and say those words. And I heard them this time, for better, for worse, in sickness and in health. till death do us part. And I just thought, wow, that's Alcoholics Anonymous. I used to think love was attached like fungus on a tree. Get you to take care of me and love me a whole lot. But AA, it's about commitment, isn't it? We're here for one another, in sickness and in health, for richer or for poor. We all know that the state of health or the bank account is not what determines happiness. It is being of service to others, getting outside of ourselves, saying yes to this magnificent fellowship. And I hope and pray that it is like that for all of us until death do us part. Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt your viewing. Taper Dave here. Just wanted to take a second to ask you to like and subscribe to my channel. Let me know if you like what you're listening. I've got some very good talks here, and this one's a great one. Just curious, do you think this is better than Zoom? Tell me what you think. Okay, this is how I prepare my drone for launching. I like to do it inside the cab of my truck so I'm not standing outside in the weather. To install the joysticks for control, up and down, right and left, powered on. I have an Android phone that I use to connect it to the drone with. And it's actually controlled through the iPhone, through an app. Oops, wrong way. It's actually controlled through the iPhone, or through this Android phone, through the app. It's actually controlled through the Android phone, through an app, and you connect it through this short connection right here.
Remote control connected.
Remote control's connected. So I pull out the drone. I have to extend the legs. Long legs extended first, then the short legs. Remove the gimbal protector. Set that aside, then power it on one short burst, then one long burst. I lay it down. So I have to go to calibrate. So the drone's not connected yet. It shows you here as this drone gets disconnected, even though the remote's powered on. So the drone has to establish it's connected. So I go into the app to calibration mode. First I'll calibrate the remote controller. Start calibration. Out, in, oop, out, in, up, down, and then this little wheel is to control the gimbal. So it's calibrated. Go to gimbal calibration, start calibration, and then it calibrates the gimbal. I don't know if that shows up. The gimbal's moving all over the place. Changes, you can see it on the video. And I'm calibrated to take off. It's acquired 7 satellites at the moment. There are 26 satellites up in the sky, which it has to acquire before you can take off. So it's connected. It's got enough satellites. This is white. I can go to press this little arrow button, swipe right to take off, and it would start the motors if I slid this to the right. But I'll wait till I get outside. Don't want to do it inside.